Hello, and welcome to the Wake Up with Gratitude podcast. I'm here with another one of my live self-love interviews with a wonderful friend of mine, Abena Perryman. Good morning, Abena.
Good morning, Julie. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited for our conversation. We've actually been chatting for about 20 minutes before we pressed record, and I was like, wait, we have to stop because there's so much goodness in here. Abena and I have known each other for over a decade. We met through a good friend, Nicole, who introduced us and just thought we would get along. And that actually turned into, some business relationships, friendships. We've supported each other's businesses over the years. I've tutored her daughter, and, we've stayed in contact even though I live across the country now. And Abena is currently a managing partner at Andrew Perry, which is a B2B marketing firm. And this is like the latest evolution that in your life, Abena, of, your incredible career. First, with corporate roles, and you've been an entrepreneur, and then you started your own thing. It's a really awesome journey that I'd love to if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing with our audience a little bit about that part of your story, kind of how you got, in terms of a professional career where you are today.
Yes, awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Julie. So I, starting just around the time we met each other, I graduated from Ivy Business School with both my HBA and MBA. I've been in corporate at a big Canadian bank, and what I found was in my core, I was more of an entrepreneur at heart. And so when I look back at my journey, it was around getting different experiences to put me in the role that I'm in today. And so, I had met a woman named Leah Andrew. I'd worked with her and admired her, and we were at another firm, a marketing firm. And what we found was we collaborated really well together. So, whether she was working on something or I was, we'd ask each other for feedback, and it was always coming back better than where we started. And we thought, we have tons of fun. We produce really great work product. Like, why don't we turn that into a business? Because we're not scared to do a lot of hard work. And we're interested in helping B2B clients deliver real value. And so about 4 years ago, we started our marketing thought partner practice, where we help business to business firms with their marketing transformations. And it's just been an awesome experience ever since.
I can't actually believe it's already been 4 years, because I
Mhm.
remember you launching the business like it was yesterday. And, one of the things that you were doing when we met is you had a business with Stella Dot as a stylist, and you were doing really well at that. And I loved seeing you, explore that side of yourself as an entrepreneur. Do you think that, like, having had like a direct to consumer business like that, did that help you sort of when you decided to go on your own? Did you learn some things in there that benefited you?
Absolutely. One of the things that is part of my personality is I'm comfortable being uncomfortable. And doing Stella and Dot was uncomfortable because it put me front and center in a sales role where I had to talk about myself. The way that you succeed in those businesses, in any business, is being able to share your story
Mhm.
and connect with people on a personal basis, being authentic. And I think that that's where I really learned how to talk about myself. When when I was scared and fearful about what people would say and do, the business suffered. When I was able to put myself out there and make conversations with strangers, ask them about, what are their own personal challenges, what do I like about what I do, and just connect with them on a personal basis, my business thrived. And so I look back at that Stella and Dot experience of one where I got to meet some fabulous women because
Mhm.
it was such a warm community.
Yeah.
I got to get some really fabulous jewelry because their stuff is amazing. And then I got to learn from watching Jessica Heron. I got to learn from the awesome training they provided. And I got to get an opportunity to practice talking to people, which is what business is all about. It's about connecting.
Yeah. And wanted to touch base there because I've done a few podcasts about, the fact that I have a network marketing business. I've had it for 14 years, and some of the skills, we may not for me, it's a career. And for you, it was a part of your story that's
Mhm.
led into something else. And I think that's one of the most beautiful gifts, is that we can all choose how we do that kind of business. But if you take the gifts from it and the learnings from it and apply it to your passion, I mean,
Mhm.
you're 4 years into a very successful business. And that, you had that baseline before. And yeah, I'm still wearing some of the jewelry that I bought from you. I
Awesome.
still use the jewelry case that I bought from you. And I actually was
Thank
like, I can't believe it's been so many years since that time. And you've been through a lot. We were kind of catching up a little bit before we started. You've been through a lot. And one of the reasons why I reached out right now, beyond the fact that you're an amazing entrepreneur, an amazing woman, and that you have so many amazing, incredible passions that I want to share, is that I noticed that you had started a new gratitude practice
Mhm.
on Facebook.
Mhm.
And you're not really on Facebook that much
That's correct.
before, right? I had not really seen you often posting. And then I saw you posting, 30 days of gratitude. And then you've continued ever since.
Mhm.
I'm just curious, like, what was it that made you start to go into this practice?
So, interesting background. I had received gratitude journals in the past, the small ones where you can easily jot stuff down, and I had I had used those. I typically would do it on the ride into work on the GO train. What I found though was that it wasn't consistent, and it wasn't consistent because if I had a lot of work to do, that day, I would spend that time working instead of focusing on gratitude. So I would cheat some days. And then, if you've got a bad week, you've totally forgotten. And by the time the next week rolls around, what gratitude journal? Where? It's like buried in the bottom of my bag. Um, as we were talking just before we started taping, I've been through what I call a bit of a ringer. Just before school started for my daughter last year, she had a concussion, which actually had her out for more than about half the year. She didn't go back full time until January, and she was in a strenuous program, the IB program. And then in just around Christmas, my son came down with pneumonia and had him out of school for most of January. During that time of me taking care of him, I got sick and lost my voice for 2 months. And being an entrepreneur, when you're not working, you're not making money. So that was quite a toll. And then just as I felt like I was getting back into the swing of things, we lost my father unexpectedly in March. The pandemic hit, and then I lost two more family members by the end of March. So by the time end of March rolled around, I was a bit of an emotional basket. Um, I was feeling like I was wrapped in a big grief bear hug. Um, I was crying all of the time. And then along with crying and grieving the loss of family was this guilt about I have so much to be grateful for. Why can't I focus on that instead of the grief? And so, um, I think about your gratitude practice and how I think it's subliminally been weaved into my mind when I scroll through Facebook from time to time. And so I thought to myself, I've got so much to be grateful for when I look at, there are people who have lost their entire families. There are people who are homeless. There are people who have lost their jobs. The list goes on and on. And I've got a beautiful house. My kids are both healthy and happy now, right? I've got a husband. We've been married for over 20 years. I still have my mother, my sister. I'm loved. I have a really great business with a fabulous business partner. We're doing well. So many people want us to win. How can I start to take myself out of what felt like this pit of grief? And so I knew this from books that I had read on self-practice and love and gratitude. And so I said, I'm going to do 30 days of gratitude. And I didn't realize at the time that you had done that before, but that's why I said subliminally it has come in. I said, I'm going to post for 30 days. And one of the reasons I decided to do it publicly on Facebook was to ensure that I didn't forget. Because once you put it out there, whether or not people really hold you accountable, you feel like you're being held accountable. And what I recognized about Facebook, I think that people have talked about how social media makes you feel pressured because people put a perfect life. What I realized whenever I looked back at Facebook, it was like a living, breathing photo album for me. And so what I really wanted to do was create a photo album for me so that every time I was feeling in the depths of despair or overstruck by grief, I could flip to my Facebook page and see all the reasons that I had to be grateful. I had pictures, sometimes I had words, sometimes I had stories, but it was really for me to remember all of the reasons when it felt like I couldn't go on because I was just overcome with emotion.
Those who aren't watching the video can't see, but like there's tears in my eyes as you share your story. First, just to say, how really sorry I am that you've lost so much during a time when it's the ways that we traditionally would hold each other together in grief and support, because we're in a pandemic, those just aren't available, right? The family getting together, the being able to celebrate those that are gone in a way that honors them. We've had to completely shift and change that. So it makes it extremely difficult. The other reason why I'm listening to you with so much emotion from myself is you are sharing something that I think is the most valuable thing about a gratitude practice, is that anybody can do a gratitude practice when things are going well. We can. That anybody can do it when things are going well. The real incredible gift of a gratitude practice is doing it when things aren't going well. And actually looking every day, like you said, you were looking for things to be grateful for so that you could look when things are tough and look at, even though things are hard. This is the thing, is a gratitude practice doesn't take away that we're going through a difficult time. Right? It doesn't do that. It doesn't take that away from us. What it does is it gives us perspective, and it gives us maybe a place to feel like we have hope and to be inspired that even though things are really hard right now in our lives, there's definitely goodness happening. So thank you. Yeah.
I'd say on top of that, like the hope is absolutely true. But what I found when I started posting was, the posting is difficult because I'm trying to figure out which one do I want to share today. It's not that there's a lack, but there's so many. It's like, what am I feeling today to share? But it also, in those moments, pictures are great because it takes me back to that memory, and I'm feeling the joy behind that picture. And so, as much as I'm grieving for the loss, I'm also grateful for the memories and recognizing that you can't understand the happiness without understanding the points, the lower points as well.
It's true that the opposites, the dichotomy is what makes it work for us. Absolutely. And, on top of all of this, we've been going through a global crisis that is not the pandemic. We've been going through a global race crisis. And you, again, before this, you're not a big poster on Facebook. You don't share a lot of personal stories, but you used your voice in a very powerful way to share a story that impacted not only me, but a lot of people that you're connected with. And I want to set this up to say that you live in a town called Oakville, which is actually where I grew up. And there's a lot of white people, a lot. I mean, we talked earlier about the fact that I grew up in a time when the high school I went to, we counted on one hand the number of not even just Black people. We're talking about anybody who was not a white person was on one hand. We were like, oh, there's the Black kid. It was literally, and not in a, nobody, I don't think, but I mean, it's hard to know because you're a teenager, that it was in a racist way. It was just literally, you're surrounded by everybody that looks the same, and there's the one guy who looks different. And when you shared your story about what was happening with your son, it surprised me somewhat to think that we're talking like probably about 30 years later,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's this, that the racism is still there. And anyway, I'll let you tell the story, because it really impacted me in a way from a place where I grew up and I thought things had changed, but your story made me realize that a lot of that hasn't necessarily changed.
So, sharing that story for me was very awkward. I wasn't comfortable. I typically don't, like you said, do things like that. But given the conversations that were going on within news, I felt that I was compelled to do it for myself and for my family, because I have always advocated for my kids to stand up for themselves and stand up for what is right. And this was one of those moments where I needed to speak. So my son has wanted from a very young age to play hockey, which is just mind blowing to myself and my husband, because we are not a hockey family. We're first generation Canadians. Both of our families come from the Caribbean. And so he wanted to play hockey from when he was 3. And so he's been begging for years, and I said no. And then I finally let him play hockey. But I said, for you to play hockey, you need to learn how to skate first. And so I set up all of these parameters in which he passed. And so one of those things I didn't realize is because he had skating lessons before he learned to play hockey, he was at an advantage. The other aspect of my son is he's always been slightly bigger than all of the other kids, about a head bigger. And so he's got speed, he's got size. And so we're in the GTHL. So we weren't actually in the Oakville League. We were playing in Toronto. And what was happening, and he was in a double A team, what was happening was kids would skate into him and fall, and he would end up in the penalty box. And so it was really frustrating, because he's not doing anything. He simply has the size and the speed. And so he's able to stay on his feet and they're not, and he's getting penalized. And what I found happening was he was starting to develop a negative association with the referees, because when kids are young, we teach them about right and wrong. We teach them about fairness. We teach them about equality. And then all of a sudden he's thrust into a situation that he can clearly tell isn't fair. And so this was around the January period. So we've finishing the season, and he's getting a series of calls that are just ridiculous. And so what's happening are kids are impacting with him, falling on the ground. He's going into the box, and he's getting agitated because these calls are continuing to come. Other kids do it and nothing's happening. And I remember there was this one game in particular where he's going for the puck with another kid, and he lifts the child's stick, takes the puck and goes, but the child wasn't a strong skater, and the child went into the boards, and the ref threw him out of the game. And so everyone on our team is saying, like, what happened? This was a clean move. There was no impact whatsoever. The goalie saw what happened. He's just like, Malik didn't do anything. Malik still gets thrown out of the game. And so this had been going on for about a series of 5 games, in which I finally sent out a tweet saying, discrimination is alive and well in the GTHL. And now I take a moment to say, when I said discrimination, I didn't say because of his color. I was talking about size, right?
Okay.
Because he was bigger, he was getting treated differently. Okay. What we started to notice was not only because he was bigger, there was also some colorism in it. And what I mean by that is, when a small child impacts him and they're on the ground and he's still standing, it looks like he's the big, bad black child. and the little white child needs to be protected. And that was becoming a problem. And I went to the GTHL and I spoke with the head of the organization, as well as the head of the officiators, and said, you've got a problem here. And I explained it, and a couple things came out. One thing that came out was they said, without video evidence, we can't really have this discussion because it's hearsay. The second thing that came out, they claimed safety, but I said, safety really isn't your primary concern. Because if safety was your primary concern, a couple things. Baseline concussion testing would be mandatory. It's mandatory in cheerleading, but it's not mandatory in hockey. He has it because my daughter does cheer, but they don't mandate it to get on the ice in hockey. 2, if a child ever throws a punch, they would be removed from the game. And I've seen several children throw punches and get warnings and not get put in the box. 3, if you cared about safety, you would either have separate groups for bigger children, or you would actively train them and let them know what was expected of them so that they could feel like they understood the rules. Right. And I said to them, I said, it sounds like, based on our conversation, you have a different set of expectations for kids that are bigger than smaller. And he started to say, that's not right. Then he said, yeah, that's accurate. And I said, well, that's considered discrimination. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? That is discrimination. And he said, you also have unconscious bias going on.
Right.
And we know that unconscious bias plays heavily throughout society, in our criminal justice systems, in policing, in hiring practices. And so are you trying to tell me that it's excluded from hockey? It's not excluded from hockey. And so what you have are him getting harsher penalties than other kids who are doing more egregious activities. And so that period was a very stressful time for us. But what that made us do was start videotaping all of his games. And that led up to a game in which he had a team in which the players were incredibly aggressive and dirty. And I want to put some context. These are 10-year-olds and there's no contact supposed to.
He was only 10 when this was happening?
This is 10,
oh
right?
My gosh.
So I'm talking about throwing punches and not getting kicked out of games.
I didn't realize he was only 10 when all this happened.
They're 10.
Wow.
And so we're playing a team in finals, and I realize this team is, I don't want to say dirty, but they're doing things they're not supposed to. And so I ask the head of the officiator to come see the next game because someone's going to get hurt. Little did I know it was my son that was going to get hurt. And so in this game, he takes the puck from someone, drops on his knees because he's lost his balance, and an opponent cross-checks him while he's on his knees with the stick across his neck.
Oh my gosh.
And then he's down on the ground. The guy jumps on his chest and punches his head into the ice. The refs have called a penalty, but they're standing back. So that was the longest 20 or 30 seconds of my life as I'm watching him get assaulted in the middle of the hockey game. And the kid gets a 2-minute minor penalty.
What? And they're 10? I can't understand this. What?
They're 10. And the thing that upset me was one of the reasons Malik could play this sport in our house was because he was bigger. So I knew that if he fell, it wouldn't hurt. He'd still get up, shake it off, and be able to skate off. He stayed down. They had to get the trainer out, and he was helped off the ice, which meant it was a significant assault for him to stay down that long.
Yeah.
And I was irate. I was fuming because he has done less and gotten more penalties. And so you cannot tell me safety first is the concern when my son's assaulted on ice and a kid gets a 2-minute minor penalty. That was near the end of the game. And afterwards, I was shaking. I was shaking because I didn't know how serious it was. I was shaking because of all of the unfair penalties he'd gotten up until that point. And someone assaults him and they get a slap on the wrist. And what I didn't know at the time was the head of the officiating league had sat in on that game, and he introduced himself to me. And he asked, well, what did you expect to happen? Did you want the kid kicked out? And I said, absolutely. I was a little bit hysterical at the time, I'm not going to lie. I said, absolutely. Since when is clotheslining and punching part of, allowed play within the game? And he said, what are you talking about? And because we had to record every game, since I spoke to the head, we replayed it for him, and he hadn't seen it. And so my question is, how do two refs on the ice, one ref up in the stands, not see my son get clotheslined and punched in the head unless there's some type of unconscious bias?
Yeah.
And when he saw it, he was in shock and said, oh my God, I didn't see that. Let me go and talk to the refs immediately. And my son afterwards, he had a concussion. He was out for at least a month. He didn't go to school for a couple of weeks. I had dropped him off at my mom's house. They lived in a condo, and he got off at the wrong floor. And he sat outside the wrong condo apartment for an hour before he realized he was on the wrong floor. And he was 10. And that was the only condo that he had ever been to for my parents, right? So he knew the floor, he knew the number, but because of the concussion, he forgot where his grandparents lived. That's the severity, right? And so what I found at the time was when I was sharing my story with people in my network, they thought I was overreacting around the discrimination and the bias. And it angered me that I had to explain to them that whether he's getting treated differently because of his size or his color, both of them are not fair.
Yeah.
Period. Full stop.
Yeah.
If they're two sets of rules, at a minimum, they need to understand what those rules are. But when you take a step back, you have to understand these are 10-year-olds in a non-contact sport of hockey. And how do you make sure that everyone on the ice is safe? And how do you not say to me, well, Abena, the sport's come a long way. I don't actually care. What I care about is every child on that ice being able to go home safely at the end of the hockey game.
Yeah.
Because this isn't the NHL.
Wow.
And so essentially what happened was a lot of reflection. There was a big talk I had to have with him because he was pretty upset. We decided to sit half a year out because of the stress and anxiety of having to continuously, one, get him to play differently because he was being treated differently by the refs. Two, he said to me, I don't understand why he only got a 2-minute minor penalty for assaulting me. And I could not explain that to him.
No. That, first of all, I honor and thank you for sharing the story with us, because the thing that you pointed out, which is blatant, is the unconscious bias. You had 3 refs who were all white, correct? Who didn't even see what happened.
And one of the things I will point out is after I made that tweet, his first game back, because he got a 5-game suspension early on in the season, his first game back, they put 2 black refs in that game. And to give you some perspective, out of all the refs, there might be a handful of black refs that ref for all of the years, all of the different levels. And I asked them how often they ref together, and they said this is the first time in their history of ever being paired with another black ref. And the thing about that game, if you recognize, he was 10. So from one game to another, they're not going to change their playing style. They're not going to say, oh, it's this ref, I'm going to play this way or that way. In that game, he got no penalties. No penalties at all, because they saw him simply as a child
Yeah.
as opposed to someone the other kids had to be saved from.
Right. Oh, my friend, you know, we have a long way to go.
Mhm.
And I think that having conversations like this and just opening people's eyes that there's a lot happening that we don't even notice that's happening in front of our faces. And you have, especially with the glaring example that after you complained and they put two Black referees in the game, which, like you said, they'd never ever refed a game together, and your son was treated as other children were, it shows that there's just such a gap and a lack of understanding. So you've spoken out, you've shared your story. If you you know, you have a voice here, my podcast does get, you know, a lot of people do listen to it, so I want to give you just a space to say, like, what can we do better right now? Because listen, this conversation is going to go away again, and that's the
Mhm.
part that I find the most frustrating is this will go away again, which is why I thought it was important to capture your story right now, because then we can continue to share it. So people are going to forget. People are going to forget what happened to George Floyd. They're going to forget about the riots. They're going to forget. So what is it that you would say for someone who's listening right now who wants to do better, who wants to be a better ally, who wants to affect change? What would that be just for you, Abena?
Um, that's a great question. And, thanks for providing me a safe space to share my story. I don't say that I'm the definitive person on all of the things that can be done. I'd say if you're truly committed, then you're not, be aware of what you don't know. And by doing that, that means taking the role of educating yourself on the history of slavery and racism in North America, because that is a powerful start to understanding the history that goes behind this. I remember when I was sharing my story um, with uh, with a couple of women on a road trip to Ottawa, and talking about the discrimination and being asked, "Do you really think they're racist? Like, there's no racism in Canada." And I was just like, that is so far
Yeah.
from truth, right? So because it's polite,
Right.
because it's covert, it's hard to pinpoint. And so what are some of the things or assumptions that you put out there based on the privilege that you have? A simple example that I know doesn't come from a place of maliciousness is my daughter's cheerleading team. They've got a requirement when she first started that your hair has to be in a ponytail for practice. And for my daughter to get her hair into a ponytail is a 2 to 3 hour process for us,
Yeah.
for washing, blow drying, styling, and whatnot. And we look at the whole week around what's happening and how I comb her hair. And so explaining to them, her hair's not going to be in a ponytail. She's traumatized because she doesn't feel like she's participating. She feels like she needs special permission. If you said your hair needs to be out of your face, then
Yeah.
that encompasses everyone,
Yeah.
as opposed to the simple thing about saying it has to be a ponytail.
Yeah. And I love that because it's actually a simple thing that we can start to look around and say, where are we excluding that we don't know that we're excluding? Where can we pay attention to how things are different for other people? And race is very important, but there are lots of people with disabilities that are excluded because we just don't think, right? We
Mm-hmm.
don't think about other people. We don't think about how we're just unconsciously going through our lives and not aware. So that I appreciate that. And you don't have to be the expert. That's not the point of this conversation. The point is, on this podcast, I share stories, and I
Yeah.
share stories to inspire people to make changes in their lives. And I always ask, how can we do better? What can we do different at the end of the podcast? And if you're suggesting that the first thing is, be aware and look at, am I excluding someone just based on their hair, right?
The
I would just
language that you're choosing.
language. Yeah. Like that.
Aware. The
Yeah.
education piece is
Yeah.
important
Yes.
because it starts to talk about how systemic racism has been
Yeah.
over the years. So while it may look on the surface like it's inclusive, there are actually ways that it's excluding different groups. The other piece would be around, how do you start to speak up for others, right? Because part of the challenge is you see something that is wrong and the silence is deafening.
Yeah. Yeah. And you experienced that, you said, with your community. So part of being an ally is saying something
Mm-hmm.
in whenever we see people being mistreated. So these are simple reminders that will start us in the right path. I grew up in a very white community. I spent not a lot of time with different people of color at all. I I never really thought of myself as someone who's racist, but I'm also noticing now that I was also not thinking about being anti-racist, which is a
Mm-hmm.
whole new word that I wasn't even actually aware. I wasn't aware that that was existing. And the education is a big part of it, is understanding Black culture, Black history, and how it's brought us to where we are today. So I commit to do better on this podcast. I commit to continuing to share my message of gratitude. And that's initially what brought us together today, is this, this real commitment you have to this gratitude practice and how it's impacted people. You say you were kind of subconsciously getting my messages, but now you're doing the same.
Mm-hmm.
Your message of gratitude is doing the same. So
The
if
ripple effect.
yeah, it's a ripple effect. So, where do people connect with you? Like, let's say from a business perspective, they're curious to learn about more what you're doing with Andrew Perry. Where does that connection?
Absolutely. There's two ways they can connect with me from a business perspective. They can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and it's just Abena Perryman. There's not that many of us. There's just one. And then they can also check out our business website, and it's
Okay.
www.andrewperry.com. And then from a personal perspective, they can always reach out to me on Facebook.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoy that you're continuing to do your gratitude every day. I look forward to it. It's something that it brings me so much joy to see you sharing that. And oh, Abena, just thank you. Thank you so much for your candor, for your willingness to be open, and for sharing. And what I hope for the audience that's watching or listening is that, I always want people to just think of one way that they can make a change, take one thing from what we've shared today and implement it into our own lives so that we can make a difference. So thank you so very much, my friend.
Thanks, Julie.